My daughter had me locked in a memory care facility for 14 months because I refused to sign the company over to her husband. She told the judge I was confused. She told the doctors I was a danger to myself. She cried in the courtroom and held my hand and called me daddy while her attorney argued I could no longer manage my own affairs. The day I walked out of Meadowbrook with a court order clearing my name was the day she realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. She thought she was burying me. She didn't know I had been planting seeds. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 67 years old. I built Briggs & Sons Construction from a single flatbed truck and a set of tools I bought at a pawn shop when I was 22 years old. I poured concrete in the summer heat and framed walls in January cold. I missed school plays and little league games and more birthdays than I can count because I was on a job site 3 states away, building something that would last, something I could leave behind for the people I loved. I built a company worth $11 million. And I built it so my children would never have to struggle the way I did. I had 2 children, a son, Eddie, who died in a car accident 11 years ago at the age of 31, and a daughter, Rachel, who stood up in a courtroom 2 Februaries ago and told a judge that her father was losing his mind. She was not entirely wrong. I had been forgetful. I had been short-tempered. I had been grieving, which is a thing doctors sometimes confuse with deterioration when the patient is old enough and the family is motivated enough. My wife, Lorraine, had died 8 months before the hearing, 41 years of marriage, and she was gone in 6 weeks from pancreatic cancer. I did not handle it well. I will admit that. I stopped eating properly. I stopped sleeping. I showed up to a company meeting wearing 2 different shoes, and my son-in-law, Marcus, who had been waiting for this exact moment, took a photograph of those shoes and submitted it as evidence. Marcus had worked for me for 6 years. I had hired him as a project manager because Rachel loved him and I wanted to give him a chance. I had watched him learn the business on my dime. I had promoted him twice. I had paid for their wedding at a venue Lorraine and I could not quite afford. And when Lorraine got sick, I had made the mistake of telling Rachel that someday all of this would be hers. Someday was not fast enough for Marcus. The competency hearing was thorough, and it was theatrical, and it was devastating. My doctor, a man I had been seeing for 12 years, testified that I was experiencing significant cognitive decline. Later, I would find out that Marcus had called his office 17 times in the 3 months prior. Later, I would find out that a wire transfer of $30,000 had left an account connected to Rachel's interior design business and arrived in an account connected to a shell company with no name and no history. Later, I would find out many things. But that February morning, sitting in a courtroom in a gray suit that hung loose on my grief-thinned body, all I knew was that my daughter would not look at me. The judge granted limited guardianship to Rachel. My financial accounts were frozen. My signature was made legally void. And 3 days later, a van came to my house, and 2 attendants in polo shirts loaded my clothes into a bag and drove me to Meadowbrook Memory and Wellness Center, where I was given a room with a window overlooking a parking lot and a schedule that included supervised meals and a craft hour at 2 in the afternoon every Tuesday and Thursday. I was not confused. I was not dangerous. I was a 65-year-old man who had just lost his wife and was now losing everything else. And the woman who was doing it to me called me on the phone that first Sunday and told me she loved me and that this was for my own good and that Marcus was going to make sure the company was taken care of. I hung up the phone. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and I started to think. Thinking is what saved me. Not rage, though there was plenty of that in the beginning. Not grief, though that was there too, pooling underneath everything like groundwater. What saved me was the fact that I had spent 45 years solving problems. And this was a problem, and problems have solutions if you are patient enough to find them. The first thing I needed was a lawyer who did not owe anything to Marcus. My court-appointed attorney was competent but stretched thin. I asked him, very calmly, very clearly, to contact a man named Gerald Potts, who had been my personal attorney for 23 years, and who had, among other things, helped me establish a series of financial instruments that my daughter and son-in-law knew nothing about. Gerald came to see me on a Thursday. He sat across from me at a laminate table in the visitation room, while a staff member watched us from the corner. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, but his eyes were sharp, and when I slid a notepad across the table with 6 words written on it, he read them and nodded once and did not say a word about them aloud. The 6 words were, Lorraine's Trust, Blue Ridge LLC, move. Gerald left. I went back to my room. I did the crossword puzzle in the newspaper. I ate dinner. I went to sleep. 14 months is a long time when you are not where you belong. But it is also, if you use it correctly, enough time to rebuild everything your enemies think they have destroyed. The morning I was released, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just a gray, steady drizzle that turned the parking lot of Meadowbrook into a mirror. I stood outside the front entrance in my coat, holding a paper bag with my belongings, and I watched a black pickup truck pull up to the curb. Behind the wheel was Calvin Reed. Calvin had been my foreman for 19 years. He was 54 years old, built like a man who had spent his life doing actual work, and he was one of the 3 people on this earth I trusted without qualification. He had visited me 10 times during my time at Meadowbrook. He had brought food and paperback novels and news from the job sites, and on his 4th visit he had leaned close and told me in a low voice that Marcus had fired 12 of the senior crew, outsourced the electrical work to a company owned by his brother-in-law, and had been paying himself a salary of $400,000 a year from company accounts. I had nodded. I had told Calvin to keep watching and keep quiet. And Calvin, who had never once been told what to do without doing it exactly right, had done precisely that. He did not say anything when I got in the truck. He handed me a thermos of coffee. He pulled out of the parking lot, and after about 2 miles of silence, he said, "She doesn't know you're out yet." "Good," I said. "What do you want to do first?" I took a long drink of coffee. It was hot and strong and real, not the thin institutional gray liquid they served at Meadowbrook. I looked out at the road ahead. "Take me to the house," I said. The house where I had raised my children was a craftsman bungalow on 4 acres at the edge of town, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and a workshop in the back where I had spent 30 years on evenings and weekends, building furniture I gave away to people I cared about. Lorraine had planted roses along the front fence the year Eddie was born. She tended them every spring until she could not anymore. When Calvin turned onto the long gravel drive, I saw immediately that the roses were gone. In their place was a low bed of ornamental grass, the kind you see outside office buildings, symmetrical and lifeless. The porch furniture had been replaced with something modern and expensive that looked like it belonged in a catalog. There was a black Mercedes in the driveway that I did not recognize. The mailbox, which I had made myself from reclaimed oak when Rachel was in middle school, had been replaced with a brushed steel cylinder with the numbers printed in a font I would never have chosen. They had changed everything they could reach. Calvin stopped the truck at the end of the drive. He looked at me. I looked at the house. "Gerald filed the petition?" I asked. "Filed and granted yesterday morning," Calvin said. "Life tenancy clause. Same as we discussed." I nodded. Lorraine had been methodical about the estate planning. She was the one who had insisted, years ago, that we include a provision in the property transfer documents granting me irrevocable residency rights regardless of ownership transfer. She had done it quietly, without making a production of it, the same way she did everything important. When Marcus had pushed Rachel to transfer the house title into a family LLC he controlled, neither of them had noticed the clause buried in the original deed because neither of them had actually read it. They had used their own attorney, a young man who charged a great deal and, apparently, did not read carefully. I got out of the truck. I walked up the gravel drive. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps. Marcus came out. He was wearing a fleece vest over a button-down shirt, the kind of outfit that says, "I am casual but also important." He was holding a coffee mug. He looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he thought he had already solved. "Walter," he said, not Dad. He had never called me Dad, which was something I should have paid more attention to years ago. "What are you doing here? I haven't heard anything about a release." "You weren't supposed to," I said. I walked up the steps. He did not move out of the way. I stopped 1 step below him, which put us at eye level. "This is private property," he said, his voice dropping. "You have no legal standing here. I will call the police." "Call them," I said. I'll wait. Something shifted in his face. He had expected me to argue, to raise my voice, to behave like a man who had been confused and degraded and beaten down for 14 months. He had not expected calm. Marcus. I kept my voice even. Step aside, or I will have Gerald Potts fax the life tenancy order to the sheriff's department, and you will have a deputy here in 20 minutes, explaining to you why I am allowed to walk through that door whenever I choose. He stepped aside. I walked into my house. The living room had been renovated. The hardwood floors I had refinished myself were now covered in large gray tiles. The fireplace mantel, which Lorraine and I had picked out together at a salvage yard the year we bought the place, had been painted white. The walls were the color of nothing, a pale grayish that swallowed all the warmth. But the worst of it was the wall at the far end of the room, the one where Lorraine's photographs had hung for 20 years. Her arrangement of family pictures, Eddie's school portraits, Rachel's wedding photo, the black and white picture of Lorraine and me at 26 on the steps of the first house we ever finished building. All of it was gone. In its place was a large piece of abstract art, green and gray geometric shapes that meant nothing to anyone. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Then I walked to the back of the house, through the kitchen, out the back door, across the wet grass to the workshop. The workshop door was padlocked. I looked at the padlock. Then I looked through the small window to one side of the door. They had converted it. The workbench I had built from white oak was gone. The pegboard where I had hung every tool in its place for 30 years was stripped bare. There were yoga mats on the floor, and a row of machines I did not recognize, and mirrors on the walls and track lighting overhead. I pressed my hand against the glass for a moment. Then I took it away and walked back to the house. Marcus was in the kitchen, on the phone, speaking in a low, urgent voice. He saw me come in and turned his back. I heard him say Gerald Potts's name. I heard him say the word injunction. I went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one that had always stuck slightly on the left side, and I opened it and found it empty. Lorraine had kept the Christmas cookie tins up there. I stood with my hand on the cabinet door for a moment, and I felt something settle in my chest like a stone dropping into deep water. I had grieved Lorraine. I had done that in a room with a parking lot view and a Tuesday craft hour. I was done grieving. What I felt now was not sadness. It was clarity. I walked back to the front door. I looked at Marcus standing in my kitchen with his expensive vest and his borrowed telephone and his plans that were already beginning to unravel. "I'm going to my attorney's office," I said. "I'll be back this evening. Please have the guest room prepared." He opened his mouth. "The guest room," I said. "Or the master. Your choice. But I am sleeping in this house tonight, and every night after that, and if you call a locksmith between now and then, I will have Gerald file for contempt before the ink is dry." I walked out and got back in Calvin's truck. "How'd it go?" Calvin asked. "They turned my workshop into a gym," I said. Calvin exhaled slowly. "Lord, tell me about the company," I said. "All of it," Calvin told me. "It took most of the drive to Gerald's office. By the time he was finished, I had a complete picture, and it was exactly as ugly as I had expected. Marcus had borrowed heavily against the company's equipment line to finance a residential development project of his own, a subdivision out past the county line that he had started without permits and without adequate capital. The project was stalled. The lenders were growing impatient. He had sold off 2 of our crane contracts to cover a payroll shortfall 3 months ago. He had let the liability insurance lapse on 4 of our trucks. Most importantly, he had been negotiating, in secret, to sell Briggs & Sons to a regional conglomerate called Summit Group that purchased struggling construction companies, extracted their client relationships and equipment, then dissolved the entity. The sale would net him approximately $3 million after debt. It would also end the company I had spent 45 years building, put 212 people out of work, and transfer the Briggs name to a corporation that would fold it within 18 months. The closing was scheduled for 9 days from now. Gerald met me at the door of his office and shook my hand with both of his. He did not make a speech. We sat down and he laid out the documents and we talked for 3 hours. Blue Ridge LLC had been established 7 years ago at Lorraine's insistence, when she had begun to worry, quietly and without dramatics, about what might happen if she was gone and Rachel and Marcus were left to manage things alone. The LLC held two assets. The first was the land beneath the Briggs & Sons main facility, a 12-acre parcel that I had purchased separately from the business itself and had never transferred into company ownership. Every building on that property sat on ground that belonged to Blue Ridge LLC, which was managed by Gerald and funded by a small investment account Lorraine and I had never touched. The second asset was more interesting. 3 years ago, a subcontractor named Henry Davila had run into serious financial difficulty when a municipal contract he was counting on fell through. Henry had been doing concrete work for Briggs & Sons for 15 years. He was an honest man with a struggling business and a family to feed. I had given him a private loan of $300,000 to keep his company afloat. The loan was documented. The collateral was a 22% equity stake in his business. Henry's business had since recovered and grown. It was currently worth, according to Gerald's most recent assessment, approximately $2.4 million. Marcus did not know about Henry. Rachel did not know about Henry. The loan had been made from Lorraine's trust account, documented through Gerald's office, and had appeared in no financial disclosure during the competency hearing because no one had thought to ask Gerald the right questions. I owned 22% of a healthy concrete business through a trust my daughter had never known existed, and that concrete business was one of the primary subcontractors for Summit Group, the very company Marcus was trying to sell Briggs & Sons to. I asked Gerald to get Henry on the phone. Henry came to the office that afternoon. He was a compact, serious man in his late 40s who wore his work clothes even to meetings, which was something I had always respected about him. He sat across from me and looked at me with the same expression Calvin had worn that morning. Steady and ready. "I heard you were out," he said. "Yesterday," I said. "I heard what they did to you." He shook his head slowly. "I wanted to come see you, but I was told no visitors except family and legal counsel." "I know," I said. "It's all right. I need to ask you something, Henry, and I need a straight answer." "Always," he said. "Summit Group approached you about the Briggs acquisition. They need your concrete work to make the numbers work. They've been counting on continuity of your subcontract." Henry looked at me carefully. "They have. If you withdrew from that arrangement, if you told Summit Group your company was not available to support their operation of the Briggs assets, what would happen to the deal?" Henry was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands on the table. "It would fall apart," he said. "They can't make the unit economics work without established subcontractor relationships. I'm not the only one, but I'm the load-bearing one, if you follow me." "I follow you," I said. "Will you do it?" Henry looked at me for a long time. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "you saved my business, and you never once held it over me. You never asked for anything. You just helped." He paused. "It would be my honor." We shook hands across Gerald's desk. That evening, I returned to the house with a bag and moved into the guest room. Marcus watched me carry my bag up the stairs without speaking. Rachel was not home. I did not ask where she was. I unpacked my clothes and set a photograph of Lorraine on the nightstand, one I had kept in my wallet for 14 months, worn soft at the edges. I sat on the edge of the bed and talked to it for a while, the way I had been doing since February of the year before. Then I went to sleep. The next morning was a Tuesday. I was up before 6. I made coffee in my own kitchen and sat at the table where I had eaten breakfast for 30 years, and I waited. Rachel came downstairs at 7:30. She was dressed for work, her hair done, her face composed. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw me. I watched the color shift under her skin, something between guilt and calculation. "Dad," she said. "Good morning, Rachel," I said. I gestured at the coffee. "Sit down." She sat. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at the table. "I know you're angry," she started. "I'm not angry," I said. It was true. Anger is for people who are surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm disappointed, which is a different thing. She looked up. "You watched your mother die," I said, "and then you watched your father fall apart. And instead of sitting with me in it, you and Marcus saw an opportunity." I kept my voice level. "I understand the logic. I don't understand the heart of it, but I understand the logic." Rachel's eyes filled. I had seen her cry since she was 3 days old, and I knew the difference between the kind that was real and the kind that was strategic. This was somewhere in between. The doctor said you were. The doctor was paid, I said. She blinked. $30,000 from an account connected to your business, I said. Gerald will have the transaction records filed with the court by end of week, along with a formal challenge to the competency determination and a complaint to the state medical board. Rachel set down her mug. Her hands were not entirely steady. The Summit Group deal? I said. It falls through on Friday. She stared at me. Henry Davila withdrew this morning, I said. Without his concrete work, Summit's financing doesn't close. The acquisition dies. Marcus will have to explain to his private lenders why the sale he used as collateral for his subdivision project is no longer happening. I picked up my coffee. He has a very difficult few weeks ahead of him. Rachel stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the tile. You can't do this, she said, her voice rising. This company is my inheritance. Mom wanted. Your mother, I said quietly, and the quiet of it stopped her. Worked alongside me for 41 years. She kept the books when we couldn't afford a bookkeeper. She answered phones from our kitchen table. She brought lunch to job sites in a cooler when we couldn't pay for a crew meal. She wanted the company preserved. She wanted the people who built it with us to keep their jobs. I stood up. She did not want it sold to a conglomerate for $3 million, so Marcus could cover his mistakes in a failed subdivision that he started without telling either of us. Rachel's mouth opened and then closed. He didn't tell you, I said. She looked away. He borrowed against Briggs equipment to fund a project he knew you'd object to, I said. He's been managing 2 sets of books for 18 months. Gerald has copies of both. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the workshop with its padlock and its yoga mats. Your husband has been stealing from a company that 200 families depend on, and he did it using guardianship over me as cover. The silence in the kitchen stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. What happens now? Rachel asked. Her voice was small. The calculation was gone. What was left sounded like the girl who used to come find me in the workshop when she was 9 years old and needed someone to talk to. Now I go to work, I said, and Marcus goes to court. I set my coffee mug in the sink and picked up my keys from the counter, the spare set Calvin had held for 14 months without being asked. I walked to the back door. Then I stopped. The photographs that were on that wall in the living room, I said, without turning around. Your mother's photographs. Where are they? A long pause. The storage unit on Birch Road, Rachel said, barely above a whisper. I was going to. I didn't throw them away. Good, I said. Have them back on that wall by the time I get home, and take down whatever that is you put up there. I walked out. Calvin was waiting in the truck. We drove to the Briggs & Sons main office, a 2-story building on the 12 acres I had purchased 31 years ago, and that still, quietly, legally, belonged to me through Blue Ridge LLC. The morning crew was arriving. Trucks were pulling out. Calvin had sent word the night before that I was coming, and the men who had been there long enough to remember me stopped what they were doing. I walked through the yard, shaking hands. I listened to people talk. I heard about the contracts Marcus had let go, the relationships he had let decay, the estimating software he had replaced with one that nobody liked and nobody had been trained to use. I heard about a project manager named Donna who had been quietly keeping the company's core operations alive through sheer stubbornness for the better part of a year. I made a note to find Donna and have a conversation. I walked into the main building and took the stairs to the 2nd floor, where my office had been for 20 years. Marcus had moved in. The room smelled of his cologne. My old desk was gone, replaced with a standing desk with a wire management system. The framed photo of the first building Briggs & Sons ever completed, a 2-story commercial space downtown that still had our name on the cornerstone, had been removed from the wall. I found it leaning face first against the baseboard behind the door. I picked it up. I hung it back where it belonged. Then I sat down at Marcus's standing desk, lowered it to the height of a normal desk, and started going through his files. I was there for 4 hours before Marcus arrived. I heard the outer office go quiet when he walked in. I heard him asking one of the admin staff where I was. I heard the pause before she answered. He appeared in the doorway of what had been and was once again my office. He looked at me behind his desk with his files open in front of me, and the look on his face was something I will carry for a long time. Not anger, something closer to vertigo. The expression of a man who thought the floor was solid and has just discovered it is not. "You have no authority here," he said. His voice was working hard to stay level. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. "I won't sit down. You are not. The competency determination is being challenged," I said. "Gerald filed the motion this morning. Given the evidence of financial inducement to the examining physician, my attorney expects it to be vacated within the week. In the meantime, my life tenancy at the house is legally established, and as of this morning, Henry Davila has withdrawn his subcontractor availability from the Summit Group negotiation." I looked at him. The sale is dead. Marcus was gripping the doorframe. His knuckles were white. "Furthermore," I said, "Blue Ridge LLC, which holds the deed to the 12 acres this facility sits on, is formally notifying Briggs & Sons of a lease renegotiation effective immediately. You have been operating on a legacy arrangement that has not been formally reviewed in 11 years. Gerald is filing the paperwork today." The color left his face. "You own the land," he said. "I have always owned the land," I said. "You would have known that if you had read the documents." He took a step into the room. His voice dropped. "You want to destroy this family." I looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window I could hear the yard, the sound of engines and hammering and men calling to each other across the site, the sound that had been the background music of my adult life. "You destroyed this family," I said, "when you put me in a room with strangers and told a judge I was losing my mind because you wanted to get your hands on what I built." I stood up. "I want to save what is left of it. The company, the people who depend on it. Whatever relationship Rachel and I can reconstruct from what you left." I picked up a folder from the desk. "You, on the other hand, have a meeting with a federal fraud investigator at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Gerald arranged it. I strongly suggest you attend." Marcus stood in the doorway for another moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. I heard the outer office door open and close. I heard an engine start in the parking lot and pull away fast. I sat back down. I looked at the photograph on the wall. The first building, corner of 5th and Madison. The cornerstone still said Briggs & Sons, Est, 1979. I thought about Eddie, who had died before he ever got a chance to work beside me the way I had imagined. I thought about Rachel, who had chosen a man I should have seen more clearly, and who was standing in a kitchen right now realizing how many things she did not know. I thought about Lorraine, who had planted those roses, and kept those books, and tucked that life tenancy clause into a deed transfer because she knew, better than I did, that the people who love us can sometimes do terrible things if they are afraid enough or greedy enough or simply not paying attention to who they have become. Donna knocked on my open office door at 11. She was a woman in her early 40s, with a no-nonsense expression and a tablet in her hand and the look of someone who had been waiting for permission to do her job properly. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I have the outstanding bid list, the contracts that need renewing, and a summary of everything Marcus declined or delayed in the last 8 months. I've been keeping a parallel file." She paused. "I didn't know when you'd be back, but I figured you'd be back." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Donna," I said. "Tell me everything." She sat. She told me. It took 2 hours, and by the end of it I knew that the company was damaged but not broken. The bones were good. The relationships with clients who had known me for decades were frayed but not severed. The crew, the ones Marcus hadn't managed to drive away, were solid. Calvin had kept them solid. We had a lot of work to do. That evening I drove to the storage unit on Birch Road. I found the boxes with Lorraine's photographs and I carried them to the truck. When I got home, the abstract art was gone from the living room wall, and in its place, slightly crooked, were 3 of the photographs Rachel had rehung. She was standing on a stepladder, adjusting the 4th when I came in. She heard me and turned. Her eyes were red. She had been crying the real kind. I set the box down on the floor and stood beside her. She handed me the hammer without saying anything. I looked at the wall. I started hanging the rest. We worked in silence for 20 minutes. When the last one was up, I stepped back and looked. The wall looked like itself again. Like home. Like 41 years. Rachel stood beside me. She said, very quietly, "I didn't think it would go this far." "People rarely do," I said. "I thought he loved me," she said. "I know," I said. She was quiet for another moment. "He called me from the road," she said. "He's not coming back." I nodded. "What happens to me?" she asked. She sounded young. She sounded like the girl from the workshop. "You work with Gerald to cooperate with the investigation," I said. "And you accept the consequences of what you did. And then you figure out the rest of your life." I looked at her. "I am your father. I will be your father until the day I die. But I cannot be the person who fixes this for you. You have to do that yourself." She nodded. She was holding herself very still. "What I can tell you," I said, "is that your mother would not have wanted us to be strangers, and neither do I." She leaned against me the way she used to when she was small, just slightly, her shoulder against mine. I let her. Outside the window, the evening light was doing something nice to the empty rose beds along the fence. It would take a season, maybe two. But I already knew what I was going to plant in the spring. Marcus was charged 8 weeks later. Embezzlement, fraud in a financial institution, and filing a false statement in a guardianship proceeding. The competency ruling was vacated 6 days after Gerald filed the challenge, once the transaction records linking Rachel's business account to the examining physician became part of the court record. The physician surrendered his license voluntarily before the medical board could convene a hearing. Gerald filed a lawsuit on my behalf, naming both Marcus and the physician. We settled out of court for an amount I will not disclose, but which was sufficient to rebuild the workshop the way it had been, with proper white oak for the bench and proper pegboard for the tools, every one in its place. Henry Davila attended the reopening of the yard, a modest thing we did on a Wednesday morning with coffee and donuts for the crew. He stood with Calvin and me by the gate and watched the trucks pull out and said, very quietly, "Your wife was a smart woman, Mr. Briggs." "She was the smartest person I ever knew," I said. Calvin handed me a cup of coffee. The yard was loud and alive and exactly the way it was supposed to be. I looked out at the work that needed doing and thought about Eddie, the way I always do, the son I had named the company for, who had never gotten to run it. I thought about what he might have done with it, whether he would have been cautious the way I was or bold the way he always was about everything. I thought that he would have been good at it. I thought that Lorraine would have liked to see this morning the trucks and the crew and the coffee and the feeling of something reclaimed. To anyone out there who has ever had someone look you in the eye and tell you that you are less than you are, that you are too old or too slow or too far gone to matter, that your life's work can be taken from you because you are inconvenient, I want you to hear this. They are not right just because they are louder. They are not right just because they have lawyers. They are not right just because you are alone and exhausted and you have been crying into a photograph of the woman you loved for 14 months in a room overlooking a parking lot. You build things once with your hands. You build them again with your mind. And the second time, you build them so that no one can take them from you. If this story found you at the right moment, hit that like button and follow the channel. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fight to reclaim something that was already yours? I would like to hear your story. I will read every one.